Hey Internet, so recently I just hit 75k subscribers and that means a QA video. So thanks a lot for subscribing. 75k is actually a pretty darn big milestone. Most channels associated with libertarian right in any way don't really make it this far. I mean, there were times in my channel roughly 2 or 3 years ago where I was figuring that I would cap out at about 8k subs. Fortunately, it seems I was wrong and I'm glad that people have been enjoying my content. Now, there's no sponsor for this video. Honestly, it'd be a little bit weird to have a sponsor for a Q&A video, but there is a new So to Speak hat on the merch store. It's a little bit simpler than the badge version, but this one is an actual embroidered hat, so it's a lot more higher quality as it's actually just directly sewn into the hat. And it is available now, so if you want to support my content and get some merch in return, there'll be a link that you can buy this in the description below. So yeah, anyway, for the questions and answers, I'm going to get to as many of these as I can within an hour. There were quite a lot of them, so here we go. Oh, and by the way, the background game is 30XX with the new DLC. That lets you play as the Dolly Cat robot thing. Never played it before, so don't expect any really high-level gameplay here. But anyway, first I will start off with the member questions. Yeah, members get first dibs. Deal with it. So first off, hey Mentis, what's your opinion on Ted Kaczynski's The Unabomber views, and do you think his assessment on leftists are accurate? For some weird reason, a lot of people keep asking me what my feelings are about the Unabomber. I think just about everything about him that can be said has been said, but as for me personally, I find his views on technology to be a little bit out of touch with reality. A lot of people blame technology for a lot of society's ills, when really it's a people problem. So a lot of his views kind of aligned with the whole return to monkey mindset, and I find that to be a really oversimplified way of looking at the world. Human freedom and liberty and what we're actually able to do and economic progress has overwhelmingly gone hand in hand with technological progress. In fact, a lot of things that people attribute to democracy is actually something that we got as a benefit of just modern technology, and democracy just so happened to be there at the time. But as for his assessment on leftists, I believe his assessment on leftists was something about how they had a mentality of inferiority. Yeah, sorry, I'm doing this basically unscripted. And from what I recall, that is actually somewhat accurate, at least the guilt part. A lot of far left thinking, especially the sort of white self-hating far left thinking, that pretty exclusively comes from a place of guilt. And then they fool themselves that by becoming leftists, they're somehow absolving themselves of that guilt. That they've been so over-socialized that they just kind of can't help themselves but fall into the collective guilt pit trap. That, for the most part, is true. But a lot of the other beliefs were just completely off the rocker. Which, I mean, he was a domestic terrorist, so it's kind of not surprising that a lot of the things he believed were way off the scale. Anyways, next question. How feasible do you think it is to bring back the monarchies of old and possibly bring about anarcho-capitalism? So I don't really think you can realistically bring back the monarchies of old in the same way that they existed back then, at least within our lifetimes. The problem with monarchy is that any monarchy today would probably try to follow a socialist system and would be more likely to come about from trying to do a socialist system than a genuine attempt to do some kind of NRX freedom experiment. However, if you combine monarchy with anarcho-capitalism, then that's actually an interesting way to look at the question. If you combine the two, then there's a way to actually bring them back. You can absolutely have a private city which has a sort of monarchy king figurehead behind it, but with the actual rules of this private society decided by a CEO. So he would be more like a cultural leader. So you can combine those two things and get something pretty interesting. But in actual Middle Ages monarchy, unless human stupidity gets so bad that we manage to somehow bomb ourselves back to the Stone Age, that's probably, unfortunately, not going to happen. And next up, oh yeah, I think this is the final member question. How old are you and why did you decide to be a libertarian? So I am actually 37 years old. Yep, 37 years old. For some reason, people expect me to be a lot younger than that. But the main reason I decided to be a libertarian is because it's the only political stance that consistently actually makes an attempt to be logically coherent in its attempt to bring about human liberty. And as a result, actually comes up with ideas that would result in human liberty, and actually does provide an ethical model that is consistent with it. Whereas a lot of other political stances, unfortunately, just don't really seem to they don't seem to see anything wrong with self-contradicting themselves and just compromising on any principle that they claim to have. For instance, liberalism will gladly throw away anything that it claims that it believes in, as long as they can be tricked into thinking that doing so has some kind of utilitarian value to it. And as a result of that, they get easily cucked into Marxism, which is just fake liberty, basically. Or to put it really simply, there's a lot of ideologies that claim to be for liberty, and the vast majority of them are just trying to gaslight you into becoming useful idiots for an ideology that will ultimately just create a totalitarian dictatorship. Libertarianism is really the only ones that understand that you need to start with negative freedom, and that positive freedom are the benefits of wealth you get from it. And of course, another big one is that libertarianism just understands economics. One of the things that made me run very far away from the far left is when I realized that their entire epistemology regarding economics centers around denying incentives, which is just completely insane. Yeah. So next question. Oh yeah, for these where there's more than one question, I'm just gonna kind of pick one at random, so that way it's fair to everybody else. So what is your opinion on Dev's criticism of libertarian philosophy? So yep, I actually did watch that. He actually makes a pretty common mistake that I almost don't really blame him for making, because Marxists themselves have muddied the waters with it so much, which is that he basically just got what positive freedom and negative freedom are just completely wrong. But I don't really blame him for it, because a lot of left-leaning philosophers and Marxists and socialists themselves are pretty dishonest about what it means as well. So if you want my answer to it, I actually to some degree already answered it in my back and forth with Vosh about positive and negative liberty. So if you watch those two videos, you'll actually get a pretty good idea of why Dev is wrong. But the TLDR of it is that negative liberty is true liberty, while positive liberty isn't so much freedom too, as it is confusing the benefits of wealth for wealth itself. And thus negative liberty actually creates positive liberty. And a lot of people get confused by that because, again, far leftists themselves will often contradict themselves on what exactly they mean by negative and positive liberty. Like when Vosh actually responded to my video, there was a point where he actually reversed the definition of positive and negative liberty in hopes that nobody would notice, in order to avoid a contradiction with his own argument. But anyways, next question. Thoughts on skibbity God, the kids are not okay. Next question. How do I explain Austrian economic ideas to my Democratic Party friends without coming across as insane to them? That's a good question. I would mainly just start with incentives, explain what incentives are, give a basic example that everyone can relate to, and then show how, by accepting that incentives are a real thing, you've effectively accepted the fact that praxeology is a real thing, and then go from there. Another thing is to just point out that the fact that the more economically free a society is, the more wealth it tends to generate, the more economic growth it tends to have. So for instance, if you had a choice between being equal in a Stone Age society or of the lower class in some Space Age society that has technology so far advanced that immortality medicine is effectively almost free, or cost an average person's day's work if you are, again, of the lower class even, you'd probably rather be a member of the Space Age society. Being advanced and having economic growth, which, by the way, is best explained as a civilization's ability to fulfill the desires of those living in the society, is way more valuable than equality feel-goodisms. So yeah, next question. What are your opinions on Javier Milei's government so far? Future of Latin America? Well, he's heading in the right direction, but he hasn't really been perfect. There's a few things he's doing that are effectively designed to get the elites to somewhat like him, so he does a little bit of butt-kissing and not enough libertarian things. But he is at least doing a better job than other politicians, which I know isn't really saying a lot since most politicians don't do anything of value, but it is still worthy of note. So next question. Oh, another multi-question. What's your favorite evolution? Oh boy, there's a random question. I don't really play Pokemon, but I did play it back when it was first gen, and I was at junior high at the time. I think I recall Flareon was the most useful of the three, and I'm sure there's a whole bunch of new ones, but I haven't really kept up with them. But yeah, back in Gen 1, which was the only generation I'm really familiar with, I'm pretty sure Flareon was the most useful. Next question, what do you think of Minecraft? I think it's a good game to play for kids. It's not a good game for people to spend their entire life on, though. Although that's pretty much the same of any kind of hobby or activity. But I think a game that encourages creativity and thinking is a lot better than a lot of the other crap out there. I would much rather have a kid playing Minecraft than a kid playing some crappy mobile gacha game or something that has auto combat and you just tap and things happen. Yeah, those are garbage. Next question. What's your favorite Toho game? I think I've answered that one before. What's your favorite genre of music? I prefer classical music, or really just any kind of primarily instrumental music. It doesn't necessarily have to be from a classical composer. It doesn't have to be from Beethoven. It just has to be instrumental and well done. And I'll probably like it. Like Tuhu music, actually. Hey, it's like your questions are somewhat related. So, I mean, if you want an example of some of the kind of things that I listen to, look up Tuhu Floating Cloud, and you'll get a basic idea. So yeah, next question. Other two questions. Done collabs with other libertarians. How do you think the libertarian movement on YouTube could improve its outreach and popularity? Be less cringe, which sounds like a really basic and simple answer, but if you think about it for a long time, you'll realize kind of what I mean. A lot of libertarians fall into the pit trap of only talking about libertarianism and not finding ways to inject libertarianism into everyday life. Marxists, socialists, and leftists and breadtubers and even liberals and pretty much every other political ideology does a fantastic job of this. Marxists especially understand that culture matters, and that's why they put so much effort into injecting Marxism into culture whenever they can. Anytime you give a Marxist any kind of control over the media in any shape or form, they're going to use it to push their ideology in ways that are punchy and catchy. Because they know that that kind of thing is very, very valid in the eyes of the younger generation, and effectively what they believe is what matters for the future. And so libertarians need to look at that and understand that. There's a lot of libertarians who unfortunately just still do not understand why culture matters and why you need to be reasonable with people who don't agree with you. And that's what a lot of people can improve on. The next question, collab with aristocratic utensil. I believe I already have actually collabed with Utensil. I've been on his podcast with the Iron Paladin, actually. Probably do another thing with him at some time in the future. But yeah, next question. What do you think of Hoppe's take on Milei? Oh boy, that one. Yep, I saw that. Now, admittedly, I have not kept up with Argentinian politics as much as I probably should, considering Javier Milei. But I will say this, though, on Hoppe's take, which is that Hoppe is half right and half incorrect. Because unfortunately, the world we live in is so disconnected from how libertarian philosophy works. If you are a libertarian and you manage to get into a seat of major political power, your real main job isn't to usher in the anarcho-capitalist utopia. Not because that's not what you should do, it is, but because it's not something you actually can do. Your job as a libertarian in that seat of political power is to actually get as many libertarian things done as you possibly can without getting assassinated, and ultimately replaced by some World Economic Forum schmuck. So Hoppe criticized Milei for doing things to get the elites on his side, which is valid criticism, but at the same time, you need to make sure that the elites aren't panicking, or else they'll literally kill you. That being said, Hoppe is right about the fact that Milei isn't really doing what he promised, and he does deserve some criticism for that. However, Milei is miles better than most politicians currently on the planet, and he deserves at least some praise for that, even though he's not perfect. Which, actually, thinking of the previous question on what libertarians can do better, I think it's very important for libertarians to avoid falling into the same nirvana fallacy pit trap that socialists do. This is actually a big difference between those of us on the libertarian right and general Republican conservatives, which is that even though both are considered right-wing, I think those of us on the libertarian right are obsessively avoiding any possible win, while a lot of Republicans are desperate to call anything a win. And I believe a more sane way of looking at things lies somewhere in between that. TLDR people need to learn how to live in reality, even if reality sucks. Because yes, technically it would be the most ethical and consistent within libertarian right philosophy to just get in on day one as the president, say you're elected president of the United States, and say, I hereby abolish the government, because the state is a criminal organization. The problem is you can't actually get away with doing that because then the CIA will just Kennedy you, and then all your efforts to get elected will be for nothing. So you have to be a little bit smarter than that. Anyway, next question. What do you think of Ben Shapiro? Oh boy. So Ben Shapiro, he says some good things, but he says a lot of kind of dumb things. The thing with Ben Shapiro is that he's more of a debate bro. I kind of look at Ben Shapiro almost as a right-wing version of Destiny. He has a lot of arguments that sound good because they're easy to say, they're quick, and they're witty, but they're actually really basic. That's kind of the problem with live debate, is that you end up with these snappy, witty responses to various political questions that are easy to understand, but in some fundamental way aren't exactly accurate. And so when one of those is revealed to be a really stupid argument, you end up with people who just kind of make fun of you for it. For instance, a lot of leftists now make fun of Ben Shapiro for his just move arguments. And the thing is, to some degree, they're right. It's not so easy to just move in the way our modern economy actually works. And another problem with a lot of debate bros kind of goes into that they'll say something that's correct, but then they don't really have the time to explain it, and they get used to not really explaining it. For instance, Ben Shapiro accurately recognizes the equity fallacy. He recognizes that disparate outcomes don't necessarily imply discrimination, and to attempt to claim that they are is not a sustainable argument. But then he doesn't really explain why it's not a sustainable argument, which, again, to his credit, he's a debate bro. He's a showman host. So he doesn't really have a goal of doing things in extreme detail like some of my videos will show. But I wish he would, considering the size of his audience and reach. But yeah, be careful with the quick and witty replies to certain questions because a lot of them actually turn out to be really stupid. Which I know is kind of silly because I'm doing a 75k Q&A here and I'm just giving quick, simple replies to these questions. But at the same time, I'm also referencing older videos I've done that explain these concepts at length. in order to kind of ease the badness out. But yeah, next question. What era and place in history do you think was the best to live in? Best political system, economy, social life, technological level, etc. Okay, this'll kind of sound odd to some people, but honestly, early 2000s. Yeah, I bet you thought I was going to say Middle Ages or something like that. Yeah, no. Economic growth spurred by technology has made it so that usually, in most cases, even in regards to how bad certain cultural elements have gotten, you're usually better off in the present day. That's just how scientific and technological progress works. It leads to more economic growth, so long as the economy is free enough to allow it to do so. Now, why I say early 2000s as opposed to now is that there's a lot of things we've actually gone backwards in terms of the competency crisis, for example. A lot of the great awakening that happened with the media and politics, and just our power structures and systems in general, and our institutions and how they operate, which occurred roughly around early 2010s, has resulted in a very big kakistocracy problem, and as a result, with the exception of smartphones, we haven't really gone beyond early 2000s at all. In fact, in terms of general intelligence, we've gone backwards. And in terms of education quality, we've gone backwards. And in terms of healthcare costs, we've actually gotten worse as well. Yeah, thanks, Obama, unironically. That's actually one of the reasons why you're starting to see a more intellectual right wing rise up, as opposed to the more cultural conservative only type that existed in the past, or the boomer conservative types. There's more people realizing that, hey, we went somewhere very wrong, and it's the result of something that we did wrong a long time ago, not just recently. But yeah, next question. Will Ron Paul use the Fountain of Youth to come back and save us? Sure. Why not? Sure would be nice if right-wingers actually had a competent option instead of just Donald Trump again. But yeah, we can't have nice things. So we'll move on to the next question. Easiest way to refute Marx to a normie. I would go with the labor theory of value and point out how it incentivizes people to never actually create a business. Because the idea that profit is theft, in actual practice, means that nobody has any reason to invest in a business at all. If you were to actually take the idea that the worker should be paid what Marx decries as surplus labor value, if you take that and push it to its logical conclusions, just about every business that exists, every company that exists, every way of earning anything or producing anything that exists becomes too risky to actually do, because you'll probably lose more money than you earn when you consider how much it costs to actually start a business. And to that regard, I think Freedom Tunes actually has some really good pointers on this. I think if you watch Freedom Tunes' ideas of profit is theft, it provides a pretty simple, easy, quick way to show people why far-left economics like Marxism just doesn't really work or make any sense. As I said earlier, Marxism really only tries to push its ideas by just denying that incentives are a real thing. They kind of push this completely absurd empiricist fallacy where they assume that because they can't measure something, it doesn't exist, which is just the highest level of midwittery that can be possibly obtained. Anyway, next question. From a Brazilian looking for a way out, do you think America is still the closest we have to the ideal libertarian world, be it in terms of gun ownership, freedom of speech, regulatory environment, etc.? Yeah, unfortunately, yes, that is the case. A few countries do certain things better specifically than the United States does, but I think for the total package in terms of freedom, the United States is currently the best. Honestly, simply because the First and Second Amendment. Those two alone are really critically important. There are some countries that do very specific things better than us, but not entirely. The whole package, it's still the United States. Like, for example, Japan does zoning laws and civil rights better than the United States does. But they don't have First and Second, really. And their culture is one where nobody really questions the media, which is a really big problem. There's also small areas like Singapore, which may have slightly less regulations in certain ways, but again, they don't really have a way to scale with the United States. But there are some sort of more private communities that you can go to instead as an alternative. Yeah, things kind of suck. So anyways, next question. What do you think is the right strategy for libertarians in terms of voting? And then he says, one take I think I agree with is to join the Libertarian Party and vote on Libertarian primaries so the party doesn't get hijacked by leftists and so Mises-type candidates can win instead of people like Chase Oliver. Yeah, there's truth there. But then support Republicans in the general election and try to shift the Republican Party and conservative thought closer to libertarianism. Sort of. I think it makes sense to support the Republican candidate so long as they actually choose a good candidate. Realistically, you do vote for the lesser of two evils. But if the Republicans put up someone who is not anywhere near significantly less evil than the Democrats put up, then at some point, libertarians should put our feet down and say, no, if you put this guy up, you're just going to lose. But as far as trying to make the Republican Party more close to libertarian thought, I mean, yeah, that's pretty much what I do on my channel all the time. That's actually an important part of what I believe should be libertarian strategy. Because right now, you have the Republican Party and the Democratic Party but the Republican Party is not really one party. As the younger generation comes to be and the boomers just kind of die out, the Republican Party really just has a vacancy there, as boomer conservatism is just not really going to be a thing anymore very soon. Honestly, within the next 10, 20 years, it's just going to be gone. And I personally think that George Bush is probably the last rhino, with Trumpism being kind of a last gasp in between rhinoism and something else entirely. And I think the libertarian right can kind of step up and show the younger, new conservatives, new right wing, that the free market is actually a better way of doing things. That all problems can be generally shown to have origins somewhere in some kind of non-voluntary interaction that was spurred on by the state. But yeah, next question. What's the best way to approach my consumer, or rather lefty friends about some of the horrible stuff they say, or are they just lost causes and I should just let them be and not mention anything political to them even if they do so? Good question, and I think I have an interesting way of answering this because, as some of you know, I live around the Portland, Oregon greater metro area. And me personally, unless someone proves themselves having an open mind first, I generally don't really talk politics in any level of extreme depth with anybody around here. I guess you can call it the biblical concept, don't throw your pearls before the swine. Because it's true, you're wasting your time. So what I would do is I would learn to tell if someone is open to being approached before you think about the best way to approach. And then when you do that, you'll already know what the best way to approach them is, because you will have looked for signs of what they're interested in. Or the lazy way is you could just give them links to some of my videos on my channel, I guess. You can do that too. So yeah, next question. Favorite philosophers? Well, I like Hoppe, obviously. But for older philosophers, I like Socrates quite a bit. My answers to that pretty much haven't changed since the last QA. So yeah, next question. Isn't it inevitable that a society will create a governing body of some kind? So yes and no. I think the reason that nothing resembling an anarcho-capitalist idea of society, or the private city model of anarcho-capitalism, which is pretty much the one that would actually work, I think the reason it's never really brought up to be, and the reason why people usually end up just propping up some kind of status system, is because first off, I mean, the philosophy of how that can even be done has only really existed for about half a century, and it is actually somewhat genuinely complicated, which is why most people reject it when they first hear about it. But there is one way out of the rocker, and that is to have adjudication courts implemented, or to have private courtrooms set up based on natural law, or in other words, ethical law, as opposed to status law. Because once you have a private court system set up, which is based around a philosophy that prioritizes avoiding conflicts and resolving conflicts, and one that is based on ethics and reason rather than just interpreting the law, as subjectively decided upon by whatever dictator happens to be in charge of the state at the time, when you have that set up, people gain a very large incentive to actually use it, because that is what you need to avoid conflict. And that is how the system of decentralized rule can come to be. Give people a working alternative to the state, and the creation of the state will stop being inevitable. But yeah, next question. Another multi-question. Do you support secession? I mean, if people want to secede, then yeah, they should be allowed to do so. That's actually one of the problems with the world and the way it currently operates. Yeah, next question. Thoughts on transhumanism and eugenics? So before reading the rest of what this has to say, I do have to say that transhumanism doesn't necessarily need to be tied to eugenics. There's one form of it that I support, and that is embryo selection as a way for a couple to get the best genes for their child. And unfortunately, there's a lot of complete idiots out there who conflate that with eugenic schemes of the past. Which is ridiculous because it's not eugenics, they're not even alive yet. But people will like to scream eugenics because it's a way to control the normies. Because normies go, eugenics, evil, Nazis. And they just completely don't consider the context of what's actually going on. Anyway, next he said, since you've made the analogy in the past, would you ever make a video ranking ideologies on Tiemaker? I know it will be biased, but I would love to hear your thoughts on ideologies you've yet to talk about. I've actually considered making that video. That's one of the ones I keep thinking of doing. Maybe I'll do it as a meme video, but yeah, it's one of those ones I just kind of have on the text file. I have a large idea pad where I just come up with ideas, then I only write them down in maybe a couple sentences that I will then go over whenever I'm deciding on what video to make next. And doing just that, a silly video going over ideologies on Tiemaker, is in fact one of those ideas sitting on the idea pad. Now as to whether I actually will do it or when I'll do it, I'll just go with someday TM. So yeah, next question. Can you please go a bit more into the practicality of covenant communities? I mean, yeah, that's another one on the idea pad. And assuming most all land is privatized, do I go and live in the covenant community that I agree with most? I mean, yeah, that's pretty much kinda how it works, although it's important to also emphasize the fact that freedom of association has to be a two-way handshake. You have to accept them, and they have to accept you. But yeah, that one is something that would need its own video to explain in entirety. That is not something for which a simple, witty reply exists. So next question. 1. Your take on city-states. I mean, they're a proto-ideal of society. What you get from the Austrian school of thought with that is the realization that it doesn't necessarily need to be a state, at least not in the way that they define it. Which, for anybody watching this right now who doesn't know it, the way the Austrians and the Austro-libertarians or the Mises libertarians or the anarcho-capitalists, as it's sometimes called, define a state is it's defined as aggression, and anarcho-capitalists define anarchy as being against aggression. That's important to emphasize because a lot of really big misconceptions of what exactly that entails, not having a state, in the way that right libertarians talk about it. A lot of the sort of bad takes people have on it is based on them not really understanding the major difference in how the libertarian right defines anarchy. A lot of people still kind of go by the layman average Joe definition of anarchy, which is no rules, which is absolutely not what is being proposed within anarcho-capitalism. There's still going to be rules, there's still going to be leaders, there's even still going to be driver's licenses, which is another thing that SFO kind of misunderstood. So next question. Congratulations, Mentis. Well, yeah, thank you. I'm a pretty big fan of yours. I've learned a lot from your content. What is a book that you'd recommend that goes over economics that is easy to read? Honestly, economics in one lesson. It's not necessarily the easiest to read, but it's mostly rational, so it's easy to understand. But most importantly, the reason I recommend it is that when you read that book, because it gives you a more rational understanding of how the economy functions, it kind of gives you a really good foundation from which you can immediately note if an economic take is really bad. For instance, it allows you to see just what's wrong with Keynesian way of thinking, and it allows you to tell the difference between an economist and an economicist really easily, because an economicist will try to rely entirely on empirical data while ignoring incentives. And Economics in One Lesson will help you understand why that's just so completely ridiculous. It'll help you see through a lot of the fallacies that you see in bad takes on the economy, as well as teaching you how to spot corrupt institutions that push nonsense, knowing full well that what they're saying is nonsense. Because of course they're seeking to benefit off of gaslighting you. Next question. Another 2 question. I will go with, what is your favorite fighting game? And that is actually Guilty Gear XX. The last Zerd was pretty good too, which is honestly the last good Guilty Gear because the latest installment is not Guilty Gear. So next question. You should watch One Piece. It's a great libertarian story. No, nah, not watching it. Way too many episodes, and I just don't have the time for that these days anymore. Next question. Who is your favorite VTuber? I would say Kirsche just because she isn't afraid of being based. Whereas a lot of other VTubers, because they belong to some agency, they're constantly walking on eggshells. And so they're forced to avoid certain topics, which is cringe. I think VTubers should just say whatever they want to say and make the content they want to make, and the people who like them for them will come to them. They will find their audience. But yeah, next question. Why do conservatives hate libertarianism? Honestly, it's because too many libertarians have no concept of strategy. A lot of libertarians would rather live in Ancapistan inside their head rather than live in reality, which is honestly a really big travesty because it means conservatives then aren't being exposed to actual good, effective libertarian solutions that we could implement now, and libertarians aren't really getting their point across, because too many of us sound like we're still living in La La Land. Anyway, next question. Glad to see the channel growing so fast. It's well deserved, and congrats, Mentis. Yep, thanks for the congrats. Keep up the good work. As for questions, any thoughts on Thomas Sowell? I think Thomas Sowell is a good introduction to some basic, simple, low-key right-wing economic thought, but he's not the best. Most people should really start with, as I said, Economics in One Lesson. And for that reason, I actually recommend most people kind of shy away from Thomas Sowell, even though he has some really good takes. They're mixed in with enough meh that it's not really worth the time or effort. Next question. Why the name Mentis Wave? Did you have any backups if you couldn't use the name Mentis Wave? So yeah, I think I answered this one in my last QA, but interestingly enough, what you just asked there is part of the answer to the question. The reason why I used the name Mentis Wave is specifically because it was a name that I could come up with that nobody else was using. In fact, before I created the name Mentis Wave, before I created my account, if you Googled Mentis Wave, you got 0 results. So a big part of why I took this name and created this name is just because it's the first of the names I could come up with that would truly be mine. And so now when you Google Mentis Wave, pretty much all results are just me. Everything is relevant. But beyond that, the actual name itself is just a combination of thought and vaporwave or synthwave. Philosophy wave was taken. Womp womp. But honestly, now that I've had the name Mentis Wave for so long, I've grown to like it even more. So yeah, there. Next question. Oh, the party switch. I mean, yeah, it never really happened, but to some degree on certain issues, party switches are happening all the time. And part of that comes from the problem that neither Republicans or Democrats actually really practice what they preach all the time. They will happily switch positions, whenever it suits them. But yeah, the actual party switch, as it's often advertised as, didn't really happen. The Democratic Party has always been the bigger abusers of collectivism as a means to get what they want. They just switched which collective groups they like more, as they realized that one was growing more useful than the other. But yeah, next question. When is Mentis coming to Brazil? Probably never, sorry. I like Brazilians, but I'm not really sure if I'm interested in visiting Brazil. I just don't really see anything there that I would really care to visit for. Whenever I have the time to actually go out of country or go somewhere else, or visit another state since I'm within the United States, I personally prefer to stick within other first world countries. I know that kind of sounds elitist, and I know that Brazil isn't really that bad of a third world country. I mean, in many ways, Brazil is fine. There's areas of Brazil that are pretty good, but I honestly just don't care. If I'm going to take the time and use my money to go somewhere, I want to go somewhere really awesome, which kind of sucks because there's some Brazilians out there who are pretty cool, but the country as a whole just doesn't seem like it's worth visiting. But good news, I am willing to be proven wrong on that. But yeah, next question. How do I explain freedom of association without looking racist? Okay, without reading the rest, there's actually a really easy way to explain that, which is explaining that you can also choose to use freedom of association to disassociate yourself from racists. It's entirely a two-way street. For instance, say a coffee shop decides to ban Mexicans, whatever. Well, let's just say the owner doesn't like Mexicans, and this exists within a society that doesn't have civil rights. Well, if people who are not Mexican don't like that, they can also disassociate themselves from that coffee shop. And that includes other businesses not doing business with that coffee shop. And so things just kind of even out. It's a problem that just eventually resolves itself. Another thing to point out is that not having freedom of association actually disincentivizes people from trying to integrate. Because if private owners and businesses are forced to accept everybody, then those being accepted have no incentive whatsoever to integrate with the culture within that business. Because again, they've just got the state holding that business at gunpoint, forcing them to serve them. But when you give people freedom of association, then the incentive to integrate it actually is there. So anyway, like I've told people about it and also covenant communities, and they all seem to think it's just a pipeline to widespread racism. Well, that's just mostly because of propaganda. There's a lot of far left propaganda that has people gaslit into thinking that the only reason why anybody who isn't white is allowed to do any business at all is because of the state coming down to be their hero, which isn't actually true at all. I mean, you could just give them the example of Japan. Japan has freedom of association, and really only a select few businesses actually ban you for not being Japanese. So it's one of those consequentialist arguments that just isn't even true. It's demonstrably false. How do I refute this, or at the very least, how do I explain why freedom of association is a good thing for race relations in America? Well, why it's a good thing is because it gets around the equity fallacy. As long as people don't have freedom of association, it's generally based on, and the way it's enforced is based on, equity. And equity is an impossible standard. And because of that, people will always look at a lack of equity to say that race relations are worse than they actually are, which in turn makes them worse and worse and worse over time. And also you can just point out the Islam is right about women question. When it comes to cultural groups, or people with completely radically different ideas, sometimes them sticking to their own community can be a good thing for both parties involved. It doesn't necessarily have to be negative discrimination. When two cultures have radically different ideas that create contradictions, sometimes it's actually better for them to not coexist. And giving them a way of doing that voluntarily and without causing conflict is actually the best solution to the problem. So yeah, next question. Opinion on monarchy. Well, monarchy is based. The only real problem with it is it'd be very hard to create it today in the way it existed in the past. But there is a way to have a monarchy and still have it be privatized. It, unfortunately, is probably not going to happen, but it is pretty based. Next question. Do you believe that rationalism is the only correct system, meaning empiricism should never be used? Why do you believe rationalism is superior? Interestingly enough, your question kind of touches one of the problems with empiricism. To be a rationalist really just means that you view reason as the primary means of the epistemology, or the way people gain knowledge. And that actually doesn't necessarily mean that you reject empirical data, you just understand that people have to rationally look at empirical data. So you actually aren't disallowed from using and analyzing empirical data as a rationalist. Whereas the issue with empiricism is that it restricts its thinking in a way that is completely superfluous, which results in those following the empiricist epistemology to end up with some really silly conclusions if they were to actually follow this epistemology to those conclusions. For example, an empiricist technically has to be a solipsist, because hey, you can't empirically measure the consciousness of other people, so therefore your consciousness is the only one that exists. And the funny thing is, some empiricists don't even go for that. There's actually a kind of a new school of thought where they're saying, well, we can't even measure our own consciousness, therefore the entire thing's an illusion and doesn't exist. It gets pretty ridiculous, honestly. I mean, the TLDR of it is that empiricism is just midwit cope. You don't actually need empiricism to do science. And in a classical sense, rationalism was actually on top. And in terms of the people who actually discover new groundsbreaking theories, we are still on top. Hope and seethe. Next question. Which US state is the best one for a libertarian to move to? Okay, so that's an actual interesting question because technically the correct answer would be New Hampshire for the New Hampshire Libertarian Project. We're trying to get libertarians to move to New Hampshire. But honestly, especially if you're on the West Coast, you're probably going to get a lot more personal freedom from Idaho and Montana. New Hampshire is still too close to a lot of stupid statism, whereas in Idaho and Montana, you can actually live in some pretty far removed communities where just no one's going to bother you ever. But yeah, next question. How will libertarians deal with pandemics? Well, for one, freedom of association actually fixes pandemics when pushed to its conclusions, as well as the focus on economic growth because that helps societies bounce back from pandemics pretty easily and have better technology to deal with pandemics. But really the best way of dealing with pandemics is having factual information regarding pandemics. The problem with the way things work now is that nobody really trusts the media, and trust in doctors and everyone is at an all-time low as well. And that's because all of those institutions currently rely on a state that has every incentive to gaslight people at every turn they have. And so when the state says that there's a pandemic and therefore we need to give up our rights, that actually leads people to just not believe there's really a pandemic going on, which of course is false. COVID was absolutely a real thing. But there's a very serious problem with social trust in the way the current system operates. Whereas private cities, going back to the model of anarcho-capitalism that would actually work, are communities that would have much higher social trust. And dealing with pandemics for a small, tight-knit community that has high social trust is honestly pretty darn easy. Yeah, next question. What is the most common fallacy you found yourself guilty of or used to find yourself guilty of? Okay, so this isn't really a fallacy, but it's more like a bias. And that is confirmation bias. The more immune to confirmation bias you think you are, the less immune to it you probably actually are. Everybody falters to confirmation bias. We all kind of get a little bit lazy when it comes to information that we already agree with, and so people tend to be less skeptical of information if you agree with its conclusion. So the way you get around it, or the way I found to get around it, is to occasionally try to debunk yourself. Take the other side's position, get inside their head, and think of how they would find your position. Think of what they would do to find something wrong with it. Try to seriously refute what you're saying and what you're believing in from the position of an outsider. And that way you'll either find the times that A, you're actually wrong and you were ignoring some obvious reason for why you were wrong, or B, you'll find out that not only are you correct, but you'll have obtained a greater and deeper understanding of why you're correct, because you will have an understanding of what the other side is thinking and how they're thinking and how it is wrong. For instance, I'll use Gamergate as a simple example. I actually did try very hard to refute the Gamergate position, and what I found was that the only way you could possibly stick with the mainstream media narrative on Gamergate is by deliberately ignoring the fact that deep freeze exists. And if you watch any major anti-Gamergate video, you'll notice that they all do this. They all pretend that deep freeze doesn't exist. They deliberately ignore all of the information on Deep Freeze Wiki, which reveals that the only way to actually argue against Gamergate is to intentionally take it in bad faith, which reveals to you that the people who are making anti-Gamergate content are either completely ignorant or they're intentionally lying to you. Yeah, the prestige-seeking cathedral-like grifters gonna grift. That's actually why Gamergate is a really good litmus test when you're looking at various political commentators online. If they have an anti-Gamergate position or they deliberately shy away from it, whoop, whoop, grifter alarm, code red, grifter alarm. I repeat, code red, grifter detected. Anyways, next question. Do you think the nap should apply, maybe partly apply to animals? Why or why not? So this is actually a better question than most people would first think of. You're effectively asking, how does a libertarian society deal with animal rights? Now, first off, the answer is no. You can't have the nap apply to animals because animals aren't smart enough to make their case in court. Animals aren't capable of working within the framework of the nap. They aren't capable of working within the rules. In a way, you can kind of think of it as, how do you deal with the nap with egoists? Because that's what animals essentially are. Animals are egoists that do whatever suits their ego, and in many ways you can't communicate with them, and they mostly have IQs below 50. And so you can't really have the nap apply to them because that implies that we are making ourselves slaves to animals. Now, that being said, people who abuse animals for funsies are definitely terrible people. Like someone who goes around kicking cats should just not be allowed in society at all, period. And so rather than talking about whether or not the nap should apply to animals, a better answer to that question, or really a better solution to that question and that problem, is just physical removal. There has to be an avenue by which psychopaths can be removed from society in order for that society to remain ethical and remain functioning. So next question. What is your opinion of Ayn Rand and her book Atlas Shrugged? Ayn Rand is basically Babby's libertarianism. It represents kind of the proto-ideas that eventually led to libertarianism to today. There's a lot of Ancap types that like to live in Ancapistan inside their head, who kind of take a dump on Ayn Rand for not being libertarian enough. But then again, you got to consider that when her ideas were first being put out, the Austrian theory wasn't really fully created. Libertarian philosophy had yet to be completed back then. And I actually disagree that it is completed at all, which is a hint for some future content. But anyways, next question. Top 5 political ideologies. Okay, I'll do the tier list video. I'll do it, okay? I'll do the darn video sometime before the end of this year. And if I don't do it, you can feel free to bug me about it endlessly on Discord or Twitter or X or whatever. Oh boy. Next question. Thoughts on school choice and how best to run an education system. What country do you think runs it best? Now, admittedly, I am not completely familiar with how every single country runs their education system, although I do personally think that most of them do a bad job because the Prussian model of education is terrible, as it values being an obedient work monkey above actually using critical thinking skills, or even learning how to critically think. That's just kind of another unfortunate reality of our statist system, is that they've all kind of geared towards an education system that is designed to turn people into little obedient cogs who will then go on to not ask questions, just go to work and then come home and consume product. That's pretty much how it works. People in power really don't like thinkers. But beyond that, school choice is based. In fact, if anything, school choice might get us out of this Prussian mess, if it's given enough time anyways. So next question. Do you plan to move to New Hampshire? Currently not really. I mean, I've thought about it. I might still do it, but probably not, just because it's a little bit too far away from my friends and family. That's just kind of the unfortunate reality of being on the West Coast. Next question. Who, aside from the property owners, provide security, punishment, etc., basically all the things justice system does now in an ANCAP setting? Well, again, you have to remember that anarcho-capitalists define anarchy as being against aggression. So the answer to that question in all cases, including regulation, is private companies, or private societies dictated by freedom of association and voluntary interaction. But most of those things, the things that the state currently provides, would actually come from a combination of insurance companies and mutual aid societies. A modern representation in a neo-Ancapistan in the future would have a lot of companies set up that act like a fusion between those two things. Next question. How does Ancapistan defend against the Mongols or the Perusians? So as long as large aggressive agents exist, basically as long as there's a large aggressive state, and let's say just hypothetically in the future you do have a few private communities actually prop up. Let's just say that one state dissolves in itself in a way that allows those communities to then exist. Or let's say that the United States becomes so minarchist that it just allows certain societies to operate entirely privately. The way those communities would have to do it is that you just still, unfortunately, have to have defense contracts of some sort. They'll have to crowdfund defense some way. Unfortunate, but again, you have to live in reality. Next question. Thoughts on your meta-ethical stance? Oh, there's a good one. That could probably, again, use its own video. But to simplify it, I view what is good based on two things. First off, I place property rights above all else, because property rights are the one type of ethics that, or really just natural law ethics, are the one type of ethics that can actually be logically demonstrated to be true. If you deny them, you end up with weird self-contradictions. For instance, if you deny that a person owns their own body until everybody else agrees, then technically nobody can act to find out if everybody else agrees, because they don't own themselves unless they can't do any act to find out what the other people say. So you end up with contradictions there. It's an ethical standard where technically no one's allowed to do anything, if you want to remain consistent with it, which is of course ridiculous. However, I'm not one of the libertarians who believes that that's all there is. There are ethics beyond that that have value to creating society. So the next thing I use to determine what is good beyond that, rather than just what is logically good, then you have to ask this question: what is good for society? What builds society rather than what destroys society? And that's where time preferences comes into be. Time preferences tells you which value ethics are actually good for society as a whole in terms of creating prosperity and economic growth and individual liberty. It tells you which ethics are sustainable and which are not, which can also be applied to culture and also gives you an understanding of why certain cultures tend to create more economic growth than others. And it also gives you a hint towards certain ethics that are fake ethics, ethics that people think are ethics but aren't really ethics and are actually in some cases bad things. For instance, equality is effectively a false god. It's an ethic that a lot of people think is good, but it's actually not at all. Because A, it's not actually true, and B, if you just focus on economic growth instead, you ironically end up with more equality than if you tried to focus first on equality. So in that sense, equality kind of feels nice to have, but it's not really something you should pay deep attention to. And the fact that our modern intellectual institutions place so much value into it is actually one of the main problems with modern society in 2024 cloud world. But yeah, moving on, next question. I have a question right now that has been really on everyone's mind lately. I'm really trying to speak for the people here. Would you rather have unlimited bacon but no more games, or games, unlimited games, and no games? I believe you meant to say and no bacon at the end there. Pretty sure that's what you were going for, but yeah. Silly question, but I'll answer it anyway. I'd rather have unlimited games and no bacon. Why? Because you can just have turkey instead. I know some people are gonna view that as a bad take, but I don't care because it's subjective. There's plenty of other different meats that are way healthier for you than bacon. For instance, you can get turkey pepperoni at the store, and then instead of having a pancakes, eggs, and bacon breakfast, you can have pancakes, eggs, and mix in that pepperoni with your eggs, and it's actually pretty darn good. And then you can just have that with your unlimited games. Bacon is nice, but you don't need it. Admittedly, you don't really need games either, but I'd rather have the games. So yeah, next question. Thoughts on unions and strikes. So unions and strikes are really only a problem when those unions and strikes are being benefited or are the primary beneficiaries of some kind of government regulation or monopolized system. There's nothing inherently wrong with people using collective bargaining, so long as that collective bargaining is actually voluntary with all parties involved. I mean, it's basically just the same thing as an individual bargaining for greater wages or a higher pay salary. It's just multiple people getting together and all doing it at the same time because they all agree upon the fact that they're not being paid high enough. Anybody should be allowed to do that, just like any business should be allowed to fire those people if they believe that they're wrong. That's just the labor market working as intended. The issue with unions and why so many of us on the libertarian right don't like unions is because of a lot of laws that privilege unions. Laws that actually end up forcing workers to join unions even if they don't actually like the deal. And so the correct response to that is be okay with people getting together and collectively bargaining for higher pay and better working conditions and whatnot, but at the same time, get rid of the laws that privilege unions. Because the irony is most of the time those laws actually end up screwing the worker over, and in times that they don't, they end up putting their thumb on the scales of that market for the labor in a way that results in it not actually going the way that the free market would logically dictate it to do so. And, you know, I'll actually answer somewhat to the other question, your opinion on the ongoing dock workers' strikes. So that's an example of how other regulations can have second-order effects on unions and strikes in a way that also makes them a little bit more demented and messed up for the overall economy than it should be. The shipment business has a lot of regulation tied to it, which ultimately prevents competition, which creates an unfortunate opening for monopoly where you have very few people needing to actually agree to stop working in order to screw over the rest of the economy. Because you're only allowed to do that work in very specific locations that the state has decided that you're allowed to send your ship and how you're allowed to unload it and when and where you're allowed to unload it and what is and what isn't safe for the dock workers. And I'm obviously oversimplifying. I mean, you can just Google it and find it. There's thousands of regulations in that industry. And I think in the case of the dock worker strikes, they're kind of taking advantage of that to collectively bargain for more than they actually deserve, which is not okay. Although, admittedly, I haven't really looked into the dock worker strikes of the specific details of how bad or maybe how not bad it is. So I could be wrong. That could be a bad take. But again, I don't want to do a Q&A video scripted. That's just ridiculous. So yeah, I'm not going to pause it, not going to Google it. Moving on to the next question. Will you ever make a video about the gold standard? If you don't want to make one, can you express on short in your views on this subject in the Q&A? Sure, I can give you a very short answer. Abolish the Fed. There you go. Abolish. Delete. Remove from the simulation. Blasted from orbit using reptilian space lasers. There you go. Next question. Go full Hoppian. I mean, I kind of already am. The only difference between me and Hoppe is I'm a little bit more tolerant and understanding of alternative ideas, because I always try to put myself in their shoes and think about where they're coming from. And the reality is, a lot of ideas that run counter to libertarian ethics, people don't necessarily believe in them because they're evil. Rather, most people on the planet do want to be good. It's just that what is good and how is it good and what do people ought to do? They can be a lot more confusing questions and a lot more harder to figure out than most people realize. And you have to understand where other people are coming from in order to adequately explain to them and convince them that your way is correct. For instance, I'll just talk about something that's nothing to do with Hoppe as an example. Religion. There are a lot of theocrat types out there who make a very big mistake when talking to people with more left-leaning beliefs than them, which is that they give an argument that relies on their religion being true in order for that argument to be valid to someone who doesn't believe in their religion. And they don't realize how insane they come across when they do that, which is unfortunate because a lot of, let's just say, tradcath types have correct ethics, at least when it comes to time preferences. But instead of giving the time preference argument for it, they will give the because the Bible says so argument for it, because God says it's good argument for it. Which is effectively like coming up to someone and saying, okay, 1 + 1 = 2 because magical sky fairies say so. Now, you're correct, 1 + 1 does in fact equal 2. And even if you're correct that the magic sky fairy exists, so in other words, you can be correct in all fronts, that doesn't change the fact that to someone who disagrees with you on both of those fronts, it's not a convincing argument. It sounds insane to them. So you have to learn to give reasons that people understand. You have to learn how to give secular reasons for ethics to people who are not secular. And the same thing goes for libertarianism. You have to give libertarian ethics to people in a way that isn't necessarily always libertarian. Basically, you have to give people some non-libertarian reasons to agree with libertarian values. For instance, I sometimes give utilitarian arguments for libertarianism or consequentialist arguments for libertarianism. I'm not actually a consequentialist, but I understand that a lot of people are, and I understand why a lot of people are. Because a lot of times consequentialism isn't necessarily a bad thing. Everybody has to care about consequences to some degree. I just don't have it as my primary ethical model. But I'll give the reasons anyways because they're easier to understand for most people. They kind of call it lies for children. Sometimes you have to tell people the wrong thing before they can understand the correct thing. You have to sometimes give people a philosophically simplified version or reason to believe in X true thing before they can learn the more in-depth philosophical reason behind why X is correct. Just because it's easier to understand the former, which gets people then interested in learning the real reason. But yeah, anyway, next question. Would you say doing a collab with monarchists like aristocratic utensil? I think I already answered that question. I mean, I may do more in the future. So yeah, next question. Bossum or rump? Okay, I didn't read all of these when I was screenshotting them. Next question. Where do you learn about fallacies? Where can we develop our ability to spot them? It's not a logic that I have naturally, so I want to develop this as a skill. If you don't have it naturally, you just have to study a lot of books on it. And fortunately, most books written on just basic logical fallacies, as long as they're not political books, they're all pretty much the same. Some of them are better than others, but they're pretty good. If you read more of them, the better you'll get at spotting them. Me, fortunately, I do kind of have an innate ability to spot them. If you have it innately, you just you'll hear something and you'll just know without being able to say exactly what it is. If you don't know the name of the fallacy, you'll hear it and you'll just know, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't actually add up. So whenever you get a feeling that something doesn't quite add up, whenever you get that sense that there's something contradicting something else, there's usually a fallacy behind it, because all fallacies really are. They're just based on the basic laws of logic and reason. They're all based on what you call the 3 fundamental laws of logic. Or some people call them the 3 core laws of logic or whatever, but they're all pretty simple and easy to understand. The first is, I believe, law of identity, which is that A is A, B is B, things are what they are, which then leads to the next law, which is the law of non-contradiction. It can't be A and not A at the same time. A base proposition at its core cannot be both true and false simultaneously in the same way. So you can't have A, B, not A, and A, which then brings you to excluded middle, which explains that things that are true, they're either true or the negation of them is true. Something about any kind of proposed idea has to be true, or proposed concept, they have to be true, or the negation of whatever you're proposing is true. All fallacies stem from that. For instance, circular reasoning is a bad argument because it can be used to claim that something is true without saying anything that hints to the negation being false. You can't just say that something you're talking about is true because it's just true. You can't have 2 claims that you're proposing to be true just pointing to each other and saying that they're true because the other is true. You have to, at some point, go over the negation. And of course, by not doing that, it can also violate the other 2 laws of logic. You can end up with claiming that something is true without having to go over negation. You can easily use circular reasoning to claim that A is not A. B is true and B claims that A is not A. And you know that that's true because B is true and B says so, which of course doesn't make any sense. And so you kind of have to train yourself that whenever you get that feeling that something doesn't quite add up, doesn't quite make sense, to kind of go over it again and think about it logically and consider the laws of reason and within it. And if you can figure out how it violates the laws of logic, then you could more barrel down and cut down exactly what's wrong with it. And then from that point, you can then figure out a way to explain to other people why it's incorrect, which is an important skill to have because honestly, these days when it comes to mainstream media, especially mass media pundits, like Anderson Cooper, for example, just does this all the time. Their main way of reporting falsehoods isn't actually to say things that are objectively false, but rather they'll report on the news that is actually happening, but then give a fallacious explanation for it. They'll give some kind of opinion on it, or they'll construe it in such a way that doesn't actually logically add up, which then leads you to realize that a lot of these pundits are just paid propagandists. They're paid millions of dollars not because they're a great personality, but because they're really skilled at lying. They're very good at coming up with fallacies that will trick the average person into thinking that something is true when it's not actually true, without actually saying anything objectively about the news they're reporting on that is objectively false. And for someone to be able to do that consistently requires a very rare type of psychopathic personality, which is actually very difficult for most people to pull off that type of deception consistently. Anyway, next question. What do you think of Liquid Zulu? Oh boy. So Liquid Zulu is one of those people who I agree with the vast majority of time. His only problem is that he's one of those libertarians who doesn't really want to live in reality as much. He kind of still wants to live in Ancapistan inside his head. So occasionally he gives arguments that just will not make sense to the average person, or gives ideas that just don't work. And I'm honestly only talking about the ones where we disagree with him on. But no, the vast majority of the time he's right. For instance, his video on intellectual property is very, very, very good. I actually recommend most people watch it. I was thinking of doing a video on intellectual property myself, but then I saw Liquid Zulu's video and he actually did it quite well. He did it well enough that it doesn't really need to be done by me. That's one thing I don't like to do. I don't like to, on my channel, reinvent the wheel. I don't like to make content that other people have already made well enough. The videos you see on my channel are videos that exist because I couldn't find anyone else doing a good enough job on it. And I mean, honestly, the only things I really disagree with Liquid Zulu on are just open borders. He's actually a pretty good guy, and for the most part, I think it's good that libertarians have a few debate bros. I don't really like live debates myself. They ultimately place way too much emphasis on quick, witty replies, and sometimes the fast, easy to understand replies aren't necessarily good responses, but in the context of a live debate, because you have limited time, you have to make those kind of arguments, which results in things that really need to be given a 30-minute lecture being dumbed down into 30 seconds, and that doesn't always construe it in a way that is true. And it also leaves the door wide open for bad faith actors. For instance, that's one of the reasons why flat earthers are good at debates. Because if one party of a live debate is debating in good faith and the other party is debating in bad faith, a lot of times the party that is debating in bad faith will end up having better optics. If you're sort of casually dismissive of your opponent in a way that comes with a very caviar, attractive, better-than-thou personality, the average person, unfortunately, will end up being convinced by that kind of rhetoric. Zulu is a very honest debater. Zulu makes a very high effort to remain consistent, which is a rarity among debate bros, and he deserves credit for that. But unfortunately, most debate bros, especially the very famous ones, are debate bros who use bad faith tactics to get ahead. For instance, that's why Destiny and Voosh are very good at debating. They're very good at dismissing what their opponent is saying and gaslighting people in ways that are quick and witty. And another very key factor of the more well-known debate bros on the internet is that they're very good at doing it in ways that the average person won't notice that they're debating in bad faith. The very good debate bros learn how to debate in bad faith in ways that come across as sincere, which is another thing that's so dangerous about the format. But anyway, for Liquid Zulu, he's cool. So yeah, next question. What would you say is your best work on this channel so far? I mean, I reference the equity fallacy a lot, but honestly, sadly, I think my best work is that video I did on how to spot mainstream media propaganda. I believe the title was How They Lie to You, or at least that's what's in the thumbnail, which is unfortunate because it's actually one of my high effort videos that doesn't get a whole lot of traffic. It's probably mildly shadow banned, to be honest, because it gets a little bit too close to home. I believe last time I looked at it, the impressions it gets is very low compared to my other videos. I mean, once you have a channel that is getting enough traffic like mine, it's pretty easy to tell what gets more impressions, which, by the way, impressions are how much YouTube shows your video to other people, how much YouTube recommends the content. And it's pretty easy as a political channel and a philosophical channel to see which things you say get more impressions despite better or worse engagement. For example, I've noticed that saying negative things about Kamala Harris will get you less impressions, even if you actually have higher than average engagement, which is people liking and commenting and subscribing off of the content and whatnot. So more people are liking the video, but YouTube shows the video to less people because you said a wrong thing. And that video I did on how the mainstream media lies to you, well, that's exposing a lot of stuff that the regime doesn't want you to know, or it doesn't want people to understand. They want good little obedient sheep who will watch their propaganda and accept the propaganda and do not ask questions, consume next propaganda piece. They do not want people knowing how to spot their deceptions. And I think I did a really good job on that video. So yeah, I actually recommend everybody watch that one if you haven't already. In fact, I think I'm going to put that one at the end of this video as the recommended next content. That's actually the best video I've made in terms of importance today. Although the equity fallacy and victim perception fallacy videos I did, those two are also pretty darn good, and they come as a close second, and they're better in terms of academic value, at least, because they point to reasoning errors that are actually common in academia. For instance, there's actual peer-reviewed, accepted studies that use the victim perception fallacy, which are considered true science by the mainstream, which results then in intellectual institutions believing in things that are just objectively, demonstrably not true. And that, of course, is very dangerous, and people need to be aware of it, and understand why a lot of the soft sciences, not the hard sciences, but a lot of the soft sciences, like sociology and psychology and whatnot, a lot of those sciences have some things that they believe and some things that they teach and propagate which aren't actually true. It's important for people to understand that. But in terms of what affects most people, what most people need to understand more than anything is how to see through mainstream media propaganda, because that is the primary vessel by which most people in the United States, and honestly around the world, because other media in other countries do the same thing, like BBC, for example, does the same thing. Although BBC is a little bit more professional about it, so they don't do it in a way that is as insane as American media does it, but they still do it if you pay attention. But yeah, give all three of those videos a watch if you haven't already. They're pretty darn good, I would say, but especially on mainstream media propaganda and how to see through it, because that is the primary tactic the regime uses to gaslight normies into believing things that aren't true. Next question. What is your favorite fighter plane? My fighter jets are rad. I forget the exact name of it, but it's the one back in World War I. Although actually I think there was a lot more than one model, as I probably can't remember the name of them. But there were those little biplanes that had kind of two sets of wings over the top of them. Those were the days where it actually took skill. Nowadays it's more technology than skill, but back then, dogfighting actually meant something. Of course, those planes would all get completely demolished by a modern F-35, but they deserve respect. Next question. Opinion on mankind. Oh, jeez. I mean, if you want to know, I'll just give the libertarian right take on homosexuality, in contrast with the leftist take, in contrast with the conservative take. A conservative, especially a religious or Christian conservative, would just say that it's evil because of their various values, that it's wrong, that it's sinful, and therefore the state shouldn't allow it to be. They'll take their convictions and then jump to a theocratic conviction or theocratic justification for the state to jump in and aggress upon them. And then the leftist proposition is that they should of course be allowed to be gay, and then everybody should be forced to accept this. Everyone should be forced to tolerate men kissing wherever and whenever because that's their choice. And then they'll justify using the state from that as a way of imposing civil rights, of basically forcing people to have equality in terms of tolerance and acceptance. And then the libertarian right position comes in and says that these are both incorrect, that they are both statist in nature, and that the correct solution is to allow them to be gay, but you don't necessarily have to treat them with respect. That's up for people in society to decide. Because there are some very real problems that come with, say, the leftist position. For example, should men be kissing in the classroom? Should we be teaching alternative sexual lifestyles to children before they've even hit puberty? The libertarian right concept of physical removal has a very easy answer to this, because most parents will say no and they won't want to associate with that. They won't want their kids to be in a classroom that does that. But leftists have no answer to that conundrum. So they're allowed to be gay, but people shouldn't necessarily be forced to let them on their property if they so wish. Yeah. Next question. Thoughts on Count Dankula? Well, we don't share the same exact philosophy, but for the most part, what I've seen of him, he's pretty darn based. And his court case was just absolutely hilarious. Completely ridiculous that it even got that far. I mean, every sane person knows that a dog doing a newtsie salute is a freaking joke. The dog doesn't understand what being a newtsie even is. And just simply being offensive to some people, hurting their subjective feelings, is not a real crime. And it's also just completely subjective on whether or not it's even being pro-Nazism or not. I mean, is that really showing support for National Socialism, or is it making fun of it? A dog doing a Roman salute can actually be taken either way. And I think that was actually part of Count Dankula's defense. He, of course, tried to say that it was making fun of them, but the reality is it could just be taken either way. And it just goes to show the problem with trying to make an authoritarian law against something that is entirely based on subjective conjecture. It's a perfect example of how laws beyond property rights can easily just become perversions of rights. they end up being really stupid laws that just shouldn't exist. But as far as the court case goes, good on Count Dankula for sticking up for himself and refusing to bend the knee. There's a lot of weaker men out there who would have just cucked, and he didn't cuck. So respect for that, at least. Next question. Do you know who Synthetic Man is? Honestly, no, I don't. I don't know everything offhand, sorry. I mean, I can make a really simple guess based on what the meaning of the word synthetic is and combine it with man, but I'll probably be wrong. And no, I'm not going to Google it. So next question. Would you ever run for federal office? No. Sorry. I know there's probably a lot of people who would like someone like me in office, and I would actually like someone like me in office. But the problem is I don't want it, which kind of brings to the issue of an interesting question, which is one of the problems with federal offices, one of the problems with states, or really just the problem when one organization is allowed to have a monopoly on aggression, which is that you end up with this curious, annoying case where the people who want that kind of power the most are also the most likely to abuse it. Me, I'm horribly uninterested in it. I'm much more of a philosopher and intellectual content creator, and a problem fixer, but not really the politician type. But, well, I'll at least answer the other question. What kind of economic policies would you personally implement to improve the country's economic track? Going back to what I believe I said earlier, I would implement Austrian Economics, rational incentive-based free market, at least a return to pre-Fed, basically to the degree at which I could get away with without getting assassinated, which takes a sort of political game that I'm not particularly fond of. But yeah, that's what I would do. As much privatization and deregulation as I could get away with. That is what I would do, starting with the regulations and state public policies that are most damaging to the economy. So I put a greater focus on the issues that would result in greater economic growth if they were privatized immediately. But yeah, as much as I could get away with, without the CIA being like, yep, we're gonna put a hole in the sky. I'd much rather prefer not being murdered by the CIA if I was ever the president. That would suck a whole lot and go against everything I would have worked for to that point. But again, fortunately for me, I don't have to worry about it because that's not what I'm aiming for. So next question. You can choose either of the two, I don't mind. Well, I'll just go with the first one. What book is best to read for someone new to libertarianism? I'm currently on page 7 of Human Action and was wondering if there was anything simpler for my currently smooth brain. Okay. I actually recommend most people start with getting libertarianism right from Hans Hermann Hoppe. Even though it's not really an economic introduction, it explains how libertarianism does a better job of being right-wing than traditional Republican conservatism. It explains to the average person why libertarianism is necessarily right-wing, which will then prevent you from going down some certain rabbit holes of stupidity. So it's a very good introduction that is fairly easy to understand, while also clearing up a lot of misconceptions that your average person who's either a Democrat or a Republican or someone from another country's liberal party or whatever. It clears up a lot of the misconceptions that a lot of people have. Next question. Do you intend on making a full-fledged video about IP? Actually, I think didn't I just answer that even though it wasn't the question? Yeah, I think when I was talking about Liquid Zulu, I mentioned that his video is already good enough. So yeah, just watch that. I mean, maybe if people watch that and have problems with it, I could make another video about IP that goes more in depth into those problems that people have with it. But for now, just watch that. So next question. Do you think labor unions are a net positive or a negative for the actual on-the-ground workers? Unfortunately, right now, they're kind of a net negative because, again, of the way a lot of the laws end up forcing workers to join. They end up privileging unions in ways that really go against property rights, that go against voluntary trade. Without those laws, unions would actually be a net positive because there's, again, nothing wrong with people getting together and all claiming that they believe they're not being paid fairly. On basic principle, there's nothing wrong with strikes, and strikes are a fundamental part of the market and how salaries and pay are negotiated. Multiple people forming together and doing it together is no different than a worker going into his boss and saying, hey, I don't think I'm being paid enough. If you don't pay me more, I'm going to leave. That is how salary pay negotiation should work. Bargaining is absolutely a part of the free market. It would actually be really strange if it wasn't. So depending on circumstances, it can in some cases be a positive. The only problem comes down to cases where it's effectively just another form of regulation. That tends to hurt the actual on-the-ground workers, as you say. Next question. If you were to remove the influence and existence of one philosopher, who would it be and why? Oh boy, this reply is going to sound super generic coming from a libertarian right channel like mine, or a libertarian right thinker like me. But it's going to be Karl Marx. And in fact, I'd even argue that's really the most correct answer by far. You see, the problem with Marxism isn't just what it says and what it tries to do. The problem is that Karl Marx gave a path towards liberty that is fake and distracts people from the real path. He gave a path to liberty by trying to focus on inequality first. And that doesn't work, but it has a problem because midwits love focusing on equality. And so Marx accidentally created a philosophy that effectively mind traps and effectively distracts those of the managerial class, the people who are intelligent and capable, but not that intelligent. And so now you have this huge distraction from what actually creates freedom and prosperity. You end up with this false notion that you can focus on positive freedom, when in reality, positive freedom is just the benefits you get from wealth that you get from negative freedom. Marx gave a pathway for the midwits to believe that they could have their cake and eat it too, or believe that they could have their cake. I guess in this case it'd be more accurate to say have their cake before creating the cake, which is a very attractive idea to someone who is looking for solutions to the world's problems, because it makes it look like you can do it for free by just equalizing the profits. And it just doesn't actually work. But because it's such an appealing, because it's such a simple and easy to understand, but again, wrong answer, the appeal it has means it still hasn't gone away. It means that it can be proven wrong over and over and over again throughout history, and yet still, no matter what, at least until we genetically engineer ourselves to be so smart that everybody gets it, you're always going to have a certain degree of pseudo-intellectual midwits arguing for what Karl Marx said, which is a very huge problem because, again, the main difference between a midwit and a dimwit is that midwits are very good at coming up with arguments that are, again, pedantically correct. They'll point to an empirical point or empirical data that is true, but then give an assessment of it that is false, which is annoying as heck because those arguments take a much longer time to refute than a dimwit argument. You have to actually look through their data and see how they got it wrong and look how they took it out of context. And in some cases, I find myself having to read through an entire academic paper in order for me to fully understand where they went wrong in a way that I can explain it to other people. For example, Bad Panda's arguments. If you go through his arguments and you're an average person and you aren't extremely well read on the topics he's discussing, it'll sound brilliant. But then, of course, you actually look into it, and it's just insanely, absurdly wrong. And the scholars he's citing actually make outrageously stupid arguments along the lines of, oh, well, this wasn't properly cited, therefore I'm going to pretend like it's not true even though it actually is true. And then you look into the citation, and yeah, it's not properly cited, but the evidence for it being true, when you follow the citation to where it actually comes from, turns out to be true anyway. And so it's all just this extreme pseudo-intellectual hullabaloo under the guise of being academic and scholarly. And that's annoying because it can take a long time to refute that. In order to properly refute the type of midwit arguments you see coming from people defending Marxism, you may have to read entire books and search through a chain of 10 different sources to finally find out where specifically they went wrong. And they're very comfortable with being dishonest because, again, another thing of Marxism is that a lot of modern Marxists especially have just kind of accepted an ends justify the means mentality. So it's okay to lie and take data out of context so long as it somehow results in convincing people that Marxism is true, that communism and socialism is the next path forward for humanity, when it is absolutely not. And next question, I think I'll have to make this the last question because I'm getting up there in time. Do you think libertarians will have an easier time trying to become a serious contender for a presidential race by either running as their own party or by transforming the Republican Party? Unfortunately, as long as you have the winner-take-all system of voting in the United States at least, the best way of doing it is by transforming the Republican Party, which is honestly something I've actually been trying to do with my content. I'm trying to make things that show a lot of just generic conservatives why they've fallen for a lot of really dumb leftist arguments when it comes to the economy. Because there's kind of a problem with Republicans right now in that there's a sort of populist right movement that has, again, fallen for Marxism, thinking that you need the state to give welfare to, but only to white people or whatever, is somehow the path forward for humanity. And it's really dumb. It doesn't actually work. And when they take those principles, they actually justify leftist thinking. You put a populist conservative in a debate with a Marxist, and the average populist conservatives will just get completely destroyed, even in the rare case that the Marxist is debating in good faith. Simply because once you've become a populist, you're actually just a leftist, but only for a specific collective group that you like. It's a totally incoherent ideology. The whole idea of using the state to impose a leftist economic system with a right-wing cultural system is incoherent, because the leftist economic system will inevitably justify a leftist cultural system. And so one of the things I've tried to be doing with my channel is teaching conservatives and general Republicans why that doesn't actually work. Why having welfare in Gibbs is actually a bad idea, when that welfare in Gibbs comes as an entitlement rather than something that is voluntarily done by, say, through a mutual aid society. So I think that trying to make the Republican Party more libertarian in the short run, and in many ways also the long run, is probably the most realistic libertarian strategy right now. If we can manage to implement a better ranked choice system, then things might be a little bit different, but realistically that's not going to happen because neither the Democratic nor the Republican Party in the United States has any incentive whatsoever to implement ranked choice voting. I mean, why would they? They currently stay in power specifically because we don't have that type of voting. So the two-party system is not going to change a grift that has been working out so well for them. That's not going to happen. But in terms of open-mindedness, at least, towards ideas that are more effective and more pro-liberty, the Republican Party currently is way more receptive to that. General conservatives, especially as the boomer conservatives kind of die out, the newer conservatives we're seeing, who are a little bit more intellectual and a little bit more open-minded, and more bleeding into things like NRX, and are actually willing to read Mises and willing to read Hoppe and Rothbard, I think the next generation of Republicans can actually be convinced of at least a few libertarian ideas, which makes transforming the Republican Party a much more useful strategy. For example, if we can get the next generation of Republicans to be less war hawk and more free trade, and stand with us against the equity entitlements Marxism march, which to some degree, a lot of the next generation of conservatives are already doing that with us. They're already against the whole equity grift. So to some degree, we already kind of have them on board, which makes it a good strategy because they're already part way with us. I think by doing it that way, we can actually get things done. But yeah, I've gone over an hour. Sorry for anybody's questions I didn't get to, but hope you all enjoyed the video. So that is all. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And if you really like my content, you can support me on either Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying them some merch, which again, there's a special and a new so to speak hat out. But yeah, again, thanks for watching. That is all. Till next time.